Welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters Empowering You series. This program is designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to you, our friends, and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. My name is David Bodary. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and your host as we discuss tonight's topic, the impact of the census and redistricting. Our guest this evening is Catherine Turcer. She is the Executive Director for Common Cause Ohio. She's an expert on redistricting reform and state-level campaign finance. Catherine advocates for greater transparency and accountable government and helped Ohio to lead toward the successful effort as we address the challenges of gerrymandering. What I'd like to do, Catherine, and I'm so happy that you're with us tonight, is to take a moment first to remind people about why we are in this process of redistricting at all and how that relates to gerrymandering.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, and then I'm glad to talk about gerrymandering and redistricting and to, have an opportunity to have a conversation about all the things that are going on at the State House right now. The first thing that we always need to remember is that every 10 years we redraw the lines, and that's because of the census. So, last year, 2020, I know your favorite year, right? We put a process where we counted all the people. And what happens after that is in the odd number year after the census, we go through a process where we draw new voting districts. And this process is really important. And the reason it's important is because, as we know, when you manipulate those districts, you can manipulate elections. And if you manipulate elections, you manipulate who gets sent to the State House and to Washington, D.C. to represent us all. And it ends up impacting public policy.
Absolutely. And it has a tendency, I think, to undermine democracy as well if we feel as if the elected officials are choosing their voters rather than the voters choosing their elected officials. So what we know from the census is that the state has actually shrunk. There are fewer people in Ohio in 2020 than there were in 2010. What's the impact of that?
So this is interesting. Sometimes when we lose a district, we get a sense, our population must have gone down. And actually, it turns out that our population is actually gone up, but it hasn't gone up as much as California. It hasn't gone up as much as southern states. And so we have had growth. It's just been a small growth. And that's why we're going to have 15 districts or 15 representatives that we send to DC to represent us in Congress rather than the 16. Now, what is interesting, about that is, that notion of we want to make sure that we have fairly equal districts, that the population size should be about the same. Sometimes they call that one person, one vote. I think people will remember in the 60s, they called this one man, one vote. But that notion of you want those districts to be about the same size so everybody's voice has as much meaning.
Well, thank you for correcting me because I did misunderstand that. So it's more about the proportionality of our population compared to other states' populations. And so some states have increased.
There are 435 folks that represent Congress as a whole. And then what they do is they look at the population, and then they have what's called the apportionment count, which we found out about in April, saying, hey, this is the number, the number of districts that you're going to have, and we are going to have 15.
And so that really means then that for our state, if we had 16 and now we have 15, we need to redraw these districts to essentially figure out, well, then where will those 15 folks be coming from? What areas will they represent? Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And so if you think about, the past congressional districts, and let's talk, you've got Congressional District 10, that's kind of Mike Turner's district. It's your neck of the woods. That's a district where it's a series of counties together. So you've got Montgomery, Greene, and Fayette. But unfortunately, we have lots of districts that are just crazy shapes. And so some of us will know about like the snake on the lake that goes from Toledo to Cleveland, which makes no sense. It skirts along Lake Erie, and it literally jumps over a county using a bridge. So there's some really crazy districts that we have. Now, things are going to be really different this year because we do have some new rules.
Well, let's talk about those new rules, because you were involved in helping to establish some legislation that was passed based on our constitutional amendments.
So what is interesting is that to get rules about the map making, it literally has to be in the Ohio Constitution. And so for many of us, especially the league members who are watching this, we will remember that it's been a really long road to get to these new rules. That in fact, the League of Women Voters first promoted reforming the way we do redistricting. This is both congressional and state legislative. The first time was in 1981. So, this was because of a Democratic gerrymander. Now, we lost. And then we had another campaign, in the late 90s, where there was a big legislative push, and we began collecting signatures. It didn't come together well. And it wasn't until 2005 that there was another citizens ballot measure, which we lost. And then 2012, so the tale of redistricting reform is a tale of persistence, because we lost again in 2012. But I call it failing forward. That we educated more people were aware of the problems of the manipulation of districts. You're manipulating those districts and you're manipulating elections, and everyone wants to participate in meaningful elections. So first, Ohio voters had an opportunity to pass state legislative redistricting reform. And this is because the state lawmakers came together and they came up with new rules. And this was in part, there was the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission that helped. There was, just the drip, drip, drip effect of the citizen initiatives. And that led to, I don't know if any of you picked up clipboards out there, but because, we went through this process where we passed state legislative redistricting reform in 2015, but they didn't take action on congressional redistricting reform. And so many of us collected signatures. When we collected 100,000 valid signatures, the state legislature began to have talks. And when we hit 200,000 valid signatures, then they came together and passed new rules for congressional map making, which focuses on keeping counties whole, right, and transparency and bipartisan map making.
Sure. I talk a lot about how democracy is not a spectator sport. This isn't like going to a Bengals game or going to a Browns game or a Steelers game or whatever to watch and see what happens. Democracy is something that people have to be actively participating in if we really want to make it as great as it can be. And so what you've described is a really good example of people needing to sign petitions, to add those signatures together, and then over time, right, get enough signatures to get something on the ballot, as it were. So I appreciate your description of that, because it does help us to recognize that it's not just voting that matters, but sometimes it's other forms of engaged citizenship, right, where we're moving, I guess, the boulder up the hill in some cases, trying to make progress, slow as it might be. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about what those constitutional changes then required, and now how we are in this process of redistricting. You talked a little bit about those rules, if that's the right term. Can you talk more about those rules and what established sort of the process that we'll be following for redistricting?
So one of the things that we should be clear about is that there are different maps that need to be created. So these are all voting districts. So there are the state legislative ones. So that's the Ohio House and Ohio Senate. Yeah. And the newly created Ohio Redistricting Commission creates these district lines. And so there was a hearing just on Sunday in Dayton, and it was an opportunity for folks to come out and testify. And more than 100 people testified. There There were, the hearing went on for many hours.
I think 2 hours longer than it was supposed to go on.
Oh yes, and I was at a hearing. I was at a hearing in Cleveland yesterday, which started at 4 p.m. And when we hit 10 p.m.,
Wow.
I was like, I think I need to do a hotel room. Like there was this thing of like, so it was really powerful to hear directly from people, and not, it's not just voting, it's that opportunity to speak directly to the decision makers about what we want with these districts. And so lots of people talked about the need for bipartisan map making and for a transparent process. So bipartisan is all well and good if it's happening in back rooms, but we all need to see the deliberations in a really public way so that we can understand the choices that are being made. And then there were people that testified about their district. There are a couple different maps that are out there, and they testified about, hey, you divided my community. I don't understand why this happened. And then there were folks that were just angry because of the last map making process. And they really just wanted to share, hey, in a real simple way in many cases, I don't want this to be like last time. I want to participate in meaningful elections. And so, it's exciting that the state legislative map making is going on. They will likely finalize those maps on September 15th. So, very soon they'll likely, finalize the state legislative maps. So that's Ohio House and Ohio Senate. And we should all remember that I think this is the craziest thing. So there are 99 House districts and 33 Senate districts. And these House districts are nested in the Senate. The House districts are nested in the Senate districts. So it is a little bit complicated. And there's a real focus. You're talking about many districts. And then there's a focus on making sure that you, as much as possible, don't divide communities, and that we create districts that, as much as possible, are not gerrymandered. In the Ohio Constitution, there's a real focus on making sure that those districts, obviously don't favor or disfavor one political party over the other, kind of the definition of gerrymandering, but also that, as much as possible, the maps reflect the way that we vote statewide over a 10-year period. And so you're talking about, the votes for president, the votes for governor, auditor, secretary of state, all those races, U.S. senator. And what's important about that is it's a way to judge, how gerrymandered the maps are. Like, are there more, how are the lines favoring Republicans? How are the lines favoring Democrats? How many are competitive? And I think, the process so far at the Ohio Redistricting Commission has been both really interesting, and I can think of ways that I'd like to improve it when we get to 2031.
Right, so there's room for improvement still. The process known as stacking and packing, right? We've talked about in the league, and there's actually some videos that people can watch about that, which really is about how do you chop up an area that sort of naturally then gives it sort of the benefit to one party or the other. And to your credit, I think you've recognized that at times in our state, the Democrats have benefited from that, and at times in our state, the Republicans have benefited from that. I took a look at the language that is on the website that you mentioned, the redistricting.ohio.gov website, and it talks about criteria that avoid unduly favoring or disfavoring a party or its incumbents, avoid splitting counties, townships, and cities, and trying to be contiguous. And then there were some other criteria talking about compactness, like trying to make sure that the people that are represented are sort of all together, competitiveness, minority representation, and then representational fairness. Can you give us any other insights in terms of those criteria?
So the one thing that we should highlight is that there are a number of very specific rules when it comes to the House and Senate maps. And I think this is important because we're talking about 99 districts and for the Ohio House and 33 for the Ohio Senate. And so you want to really focus on, if possible, keeping counties whole. All right, well, the population needs to be divided, well, then you keep a city whole. Oh, well, then we try to keep townships whole. And so it's a proxy for keeping communities together. It's not perfect, but saying, hey, let's keep our townships and our cities and our counties whole as much as possible, and that the divisions are based on the needs of population, so that the population is equal in all of these different districts. But then to say, okay, once you do that, well, we also need to make sure that they do not, as you said, unduly favor one political party or the other. Now, you might say, oh, wait a second, what about unduly? This sounds like we're suggesting there should be some gerrymandering. Well, no, of course not. But the problem is you're always going to create a map that favors one party or the other. It's hard to be absolutely even Stevens, so that's why they say unduly. The other thing to remember is because of what's called representational fairness, which I talked a little bit about before, is that we have an expectation that the district lines will favor the statewide outcomes. Meaning, let's look at a 10-year period. You're talking about 54% Republican, 46 Democratic. And so when we assess those lines, some of them should be Democratic, some of them should be Republican. They should be about the same. And then in there, we should expect that there will be some competitive districts. And the reason we should expect that is if you're not manipulating those districts to unduly, inappropriately favor one political party over the other, well, then you are going to have some more competitive districts. Now, there are going to be areas of the state where, it's impossible to have a competitive district. There are areas that are just incredibly Republican, and there are areas that are incredibly Democratic. And so we'd all like to participate in competitive elections, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure those district lines are not manipulated to advantage one party or the other.
I appreciate that. There's so many directions my brain is going. I mean, one of the problems that these sort of non-competitive districts creates then is that the race that really matters is the primary instead of the election, right? So it's what happens maybe in May instead of what happens in November. And of course, then what happens is that people end up being farther in one direction or the other, polarized, right, in terms of trying to attract whatever they consider to be their base. So we end up perhaps ending up with different kinds of people that could be elected in those areas. I'm trying to be careful about the words I use, right? But more extreme, maybe, is a way to think of it. And yet, I think those people still need to represent all of the individuals that are in their district.
So what you're getting at is we're balancing a bunch of different variables, and that's why there are these different criteria. There's a criteria of compactness and keeping communities together. There's the criteria about, hey, don't gerrymander. The looking and seeing, okay, is this actually, representational fairness? Is it balanced? But the other thing to remember, when you were talking about, the primary can become the most important election, which leaves, with extremism, but also we should have districts where the political party, the partisan index of a map doesn't make it so, okay, this is always going to be a Republican, even if there is some type of really bad behavior. And this makes me think about Larry Householder, who was a former Speaker of the House, easily won re-election. He easily won re-election. And that is because the Democrats did not even put somebody up against him. And they chose not to put anybody up against him because it seemed like that it was a losing election. And so that's the other problem with really extreme gerrymandering, is that even when somebody is really unsuitable, they can easily get reelected. And so we want to make sure that these districts are responsive to the needs of voters and that they can vote out the bombs, you know how that goes? They can vote out the people that are not reflective of their values. And gerrymandering can get in the way of that.
So you mentioned, though, that the state representatives, the map are being drawn up by the 15th, but that then leaves the congressional, the federal level, right? When are those maps due?
So this becomes a little bit complicated. So when the state legislators were trying to think about, well, how do we put new rules in place? And they wanted to be sure that it was bipartisan map making, and they wanted to be sure that the state legislature was doing the map making. This was very important to them. And many of us have heard about independent commissions. For example, in California, there's a new one in Michigan. And that's kind of exciting to say, hey, let's take this out of the hands of elected officials. But we tried that a few times, 1981, 2005, and 2012. So when the legislature said, hey, we want to do this, we're going to come up with a way to do this in a bipartisan fashion, they had to get a little creative. And that's why you can't say, oh, this is the deadline. So there is a first deadline, which is September 30th. And September 30th is when the state legislature has the opportunity to finalize congressional district lines. And they have to have, when I said bipartisan, 50%, it's a supermajority in both chambers, Ohio House and Ohio Senate. And then it's 50% of the Democrats and 50% of the Republicans that have to approve it. If they can't do that, because that's supermajority, both chambers, and 50% of both political parties, that's a really high bar.
Right.
It then goes to the Ohio Redistricting Commission. And the Ohio Redistricting Commission has until the end of October to draw congressional district lines. And so the rules for the Ohio Redistricting Commission are a little bit complicated too. You have to have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans to approve it. In other words, to get to bipartisan map making, you might say, oh, wait a second, the Redistricting Commission doesn't have as many Democrats. Well, it doesn't, but they have more power in many ways. 2 Democrats have a solid veto on any Republican map that they don't like. Well then, let's say the Redistricting Commission is like, oh my gosh, we can't do this either. It goes back to the state legislature. And so they were trying to think about how do we get folks to actually create a good map? And so they created different deadlines. They tried different bodies to come up with, these bipartisan maps that focus on keeping counties whole, because this is Congress and there are fewer districts. And it was a real challenge. So the final deadline, in case anyone is paying attention, is November 30th.
Okay.
So this is the other thing about redistricting. It's map making that happens every 10 years, and it's super complicated. And you can see why people are like, okay, am I sure I want to participate in this process? Because it is a little bit complicated.
But I want to say it is, but there also was a contest that I think your organization was involved in, which invited people to take a look at the data, the census data, and then take a look at some software that helps to draw these maps, and some students or other people, citizens, right, were able to have a chance to create some maps. Is that right?
So that's right. So one of the things that is interesting about Ohio's history, so we've had this long kind of battle to get good rules in place, and we now have them, and we need to make sure they're implemented properly. But even in the 80s, that was the first time there was a redistricting competition. League of Women Voter president at the time, a woman named Joan Lawrence, Rep. Joan Lawrence, although at this point she's a former rep, she advocated with others to really, to do these competitions. That idea of, if we have the map makers, meaning if we have elected officials always doing this, well, then it's this mysterious process. Let's democratize map making. Let's make sure people have the tools so that they can make the maps. Well, you can imagine in the 80s and 90s, and even in 2011, this was a little more complicated. But we're in a time period where there's really good software so this time what we did is we said, this is the fair mapping competition, and keep in mind, we are still waiting for congressional maps. The deadline for that is September 15th, so tomorrow at midnight. So please get your maps in. So what's good about this is there's District-er, which is created by the Tufts University staff there. And like Tinder, it's District-er. And then there's also Dave's redistricting app that everybody loves, because there's a lot of really good data there where you can look at minority representation and consider the Voting Rights Act and the implications there. And there are other ones that are also good. There's one called District Builder, and District Builder is what we used in our competition in 2011. So one of the things that's really important about this is we can talk about not wanting gerrymandered districts, but the ability for the public to say, okay, this is what I'd like to see. Hey, can you make your maps look like my maps? We're really in a different time period because there have been many district maps that have been submitted to the Ohio Redistricting Commission so far. And so I would encourage folks to check out those maps because yes, the official ones so far are very interesting, but so are the ones that citizens are submitting.
Right. Well, thank you. You know, it's so exciting, and I think you're reinforcing my main message that democracy is not a spectator sport, and now with this new software, there's even easier ways for us to be able to become engaged and to understand what was maybe once considered mysterious. I want to give you a chance to identify any last insights as we've just got a couple minutes left. What is next, perhaps, from your perspective? Are there any other opportunities for folks to become engaged?
So I think for some of us, we've gone to testify, we've sent postcards or written letters about the importance of transparent map making. Now is the point we need to hold these folks' feet to the fire. We need to be able to understand the choices that they're made, the choices they make, because every district line is a choice, and we need to have really good public deliberation. We do have State Map Day. It's like we're calling it Fair Maps Day. It's on September 21st. It's from 10 until 2 p.m. This is an opportunity to do a rally, attend a press conference, do a little lobbying yourself. It's like a lobby day at the State House and talk to our representatives there, our Ohio House members, our Ohio Senate members, and let them know that we expect transparent bipartisan map making and that we are looking forward to participating in public hearings, and we need fair congressional maps.
Yes, that we're not just watching, we're paying attention and we're involved. I appreciate that. Well, we want to thank our guest, Catherine Turcer, the Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio, for her insights on the impact of the census on the process of redistricting. And I want to thank all of you for watching League of Women Voters Empowering You. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to be a voter by being registered to vote and then actively voting every election. Remember, as I've said many times, democracy is not a spectator sport. And so if you have further questions, perhaps about how to register to become a voter, how to vote in an upcoming election, or perhaps where you need to be able to vote, or if you have ideas about programs that you'd like to recommend for this program, please contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org. That's league@lwvdayton.org. Or you can call the office at 937-228-4041. Be well. Thank you again, Kathleen. I really appreciate your time. But be well, be active, and be awesome. Good night.